Okay, it's back. Okay, sorry about that. So as I was saying, first, I wouldn't be here if it were not for the people and organization that supported me those past 9 years. So there is, I'm quite fortunate that there is a fair number of them, and especially University of Alberta and Canada Wildfires, and actually, I was requested to mostly talk about the work I've done those past years within Canada Wildfire at the University of Alberta. So I'm going to cover. I mean, it's 1 hour, like it's 45 minutes of me talking, and so like it can only really remain quite general. But we're going to talk about like by the end of this presentation, hopefully, with this talk, you're going to have a better understanding of like the relationship between forests and freshwater, and how wildfires, like how forests contribute to water security, but how wildfire can actually threaten water security, and what do we do, or generally what do I do in terms of wildfire watershed risk research now as part of the Canadian Forest Service, but formerly as part of Canada Wildfire as well. And finally, I would talk a little bit more about data and methods, and mostly about data to kind of trying to tackle this emerging risk like wildfire watershed risk. And on the left, just quickly, if you guys have a chance, just a fun thing to do, it's called wombo.art, and it's an artificial intelligence application. You just feed it with words, and you get an image based on AI. And I just input my the title of my thesis, and that's something like that I got. It's pretty dire image, but I think I think it just like really it shows pretty well that what we are facing at the moment, So just something fun to do, and like you might be surprised, like agreeably surprised by the result you get. All right, so let's talk about forest and freshwater. I think there is like a general acknowledgement that forests, almost provide water, or at least like people definitely agree that forests are critical for freshwater provision. And why is that? Well, because forests are able to provide like those three main functions that you can see on the right, like shield, sponge, and filter. That's the first one being like this kind of shield function. Why is that? Well, you have, like the forest canopy here, and that's at the stand scale. That's a pretty rough diagram. You don't really need to, there is no percentages or like amounts of for the amount of the flux is going back down on the side. It's just like for you to get like a general idea of what's going on when it's raining or when there is generally precipitation over a forest. So the first thing is like canopy is going to intercept this amount of water going down, and by intercepting this water, a large part of this water that is intercepted is going to be re-emitted through evaporation, and in so doing, it protects the soil from the erosive power of raindrops. So that this is what I call like this shield effect, or this function more specifically. Then there is what we call the sponge effect. It's very well documented. Like, so even though like the majority of rainfall is going to be intercepted and a large part of it is going to be re-emitted through evaporation, like a part of this water that is intercepted is just going to get through the canopy, like as stem flows, as through flow, and will just reach the ground. And I think when we talk about forest, usually people think about forest and they see the trees, they think about the trees. But when it comes to forest and water specifically, what is even probably as important, if not more important than trees, is the soil. And a healthy forest really is like a forest with, trees that are healthy, but also a healthy soil with like a lot of organic matter. Why that? Because then you have a soil with a good texture that is able to absorb this water that's reaching the ground. So either through, yes, as I said, like a good soil texture, but also like following the root systems. Actually going to take my pointer here. So like, yes, the water can actually infiltrate and go, like part of it like will percolate and provide and just fill in aquifers, and so like provide water downstream, like down to the water table that will flow downstream and feed the streams, feed the rivers during especially dry periods of time. And a part of it is part of this water reaching the ground is going to run off. Another part is going to go down as subsurface flow. But as you can see, usually forests are really as this specific sponge function that really holds the water and make it available along all along the year. And this final function here is this filter function that by going through the soil, and once again, that's really a big importance of forest soils. Like by going through the soil, this soil has this capacity, like your coffee filter, like maybe you can imagine like more like a sieve, can actually retain a number of chemical compounds, and many of them, when in high concentration, can actually affect water quality and just go from chemical compounds to actual toxicants or pollutants, if you will. So that's it for the general sort of effect of the role of fresh water at the stand level. But now there are more and more research that also show that forests at the global scale have this very important role, obviously downstream, but also downwind. So like we are increasingly able to document through and to model this role of forests, the teleconnection forests have with downwind rainfall. So for instance, the Amazon forest have like a huge role in terms of like what we call the precipitation shed in further south in South America. So what we call here like this number 2 that you can see here, that's what is intercepted, what is re-emitted, and that's what we call green water. But it's a whole cycle that once again is I wouldn't say control, but to which forest like takes an active part. And yes, because those forests like are so important for freshwater provision, they actually provide what we call ecosystem services, and I'm quite sure you're familiar with the term. And it's increasingly important in an urban planet. Like over half of the population in the world lives in cities. Of pretty much 80% of large cities in the world draw their drinking water from surface water, so from terrestrial watersheds, and part of them are covered by forests. And as you can see here, forests, provide a whole lot of different services and benefits from, yes, stormwater control. They control water quality. So like we have documents showing that surface water coming from healthy forested watersheds are usually of a better raw quality and so are cheaper to treat. And also like there is like temperature and precipitation regulation, as I said earlier. So because those ecosystem services from forests and because of this importance of forests, like there is a clear link between forest and what we call water security. And water security is kind of a pretty hot topic lately, and especially with now like the new BC Water Security Fund coming up. And you guys have probably heard a lot about this word water security, but I think unfortunately we talk about it a lot, but it's not necessarily well defined. And so water security, like for the longest time, has been defined as the capacity of an individual or a society to safely access a decent amount of good quality water to fulfill their daily needs. And actually that applies to ecosystems as well. And increasingly, we even specifically focus on what we call water-related risks. And some recent definitions actually have talked only, like there is a recent definition of water security that just go like that. Water security is reaching a tolerable amount of risk, water-related risk to society. And so like not even considering those other aspects, but those other aspects of water security are important. So like you're at home, you're able to just turn on the tap, you have water. Being able to have water for irrigation, for production of a number of economic goods, water for aquatic ecosystems. So all those aspects are important to water security. But once again, the idea of water-related risk is really increasingly taking over this overall definition and studies about water security. And this is what I do. This is my work. I'm not a fire ecologist. I'm not a hydrologist. I'm a risk geographer. What I like is risk and disaster risk reduction, and specifically in this context, I like working on wildfires and water security and what it means to trying to make those two things work together. So, all right. So now that hopefully you have a better idea of like the role of water, forests in freshwater provision and water security, let's discuss how wildfires can actually, I guess, like, create some sort of a mess in that. Here, this is a picture of the Cameron Falls in southern Alberta, and that was after the 2017 Keno fire, and that was in Waterton National Park. And you can see here there's like some burnt forests right here. And usually this waterfall is kind of crystal blue. It's beautiful. A lot of tourists going there, but it's just after the fire, and you see here it's loaded with ash, with sediments. You can imagine that fish don't like that, would probably not go for a swim in that as well. So just like a quick illustration of like what can happen after a fire. And those two pictures really embody what I call wildfire watershed risks and what can happen. So here on the upper left, you have this huge fire taking over the mountain, and you have like this lake here downstream. Like very likely those forests those mountains here provide water to like feed water to this lake that is located downstream. And usually we tend to talk, when we talk about post-fire hydrology or post-fire issues for water quality, usually we agree to say that there is this 20% threshold like that we need to reach. So 20% of the watershed being burned, like medium to high, very high intensity. It's even worse when it happens in a pretty rugged terrain, as you can see here, because erosion can happen much more easily. And the last ingredient I would say to this disaster recipe is like a fire followed by rainfall. So here, like it's kind of a like pretty heavy rainfall, but actually you don't necessarily need to have very heavy precipitation. Like even a 1 in 2 year storm can be enough to trigger flash flood in very small catchments, because small catchments after a fire becomes much more flashy. There is nothing to retain the water anymore, and so like even like small storms can really create mayhem. But we are right now in terms of scientific research and climate change. We focus a lot about on extremes, and what happened in Australia a couple of years ago during the Black Summer was really illustrated by extremes. They had extreme wildfires, but that was followed by record rainfall. Like that was the biggest rainfall they had in 40 years. So that's kind of worst case scenario that happened over there. They had floods, they had issues for water provision. So that's kind of like the two things. If you only have to keep two things in mind from these presentations, like those two images, like putting them together. And so why is that? Why does it create a problem for water supply? Well, you see here those effects those functions I was talking about, like shield, sponge, and filter. Well, after a fire, they're just gone, and for very like obvious reasons. When you look at this diagram, there is no forest or like vegetation cover anymore. So like this interception, like this shield effect, is just gone. So like precipitation, especially after a storm, it's just going hard on the ground. And if there is a high burn severity, like you're down to the mineral soil, there is nothing to hold this soil anymore. And with high burn severity, all the organic matter in the soil like tends to disappear, like the soil structure collapses, and so nothing is really binding the soil particles together. So when the rains comes down, it like high runoff velocity, very high erosive power. So you have so that's the first issue. You obviously have a lot of debris as well, and because and another effect, like especially linked to those changes to the soil structure, there's a problem that we call hydrophobicity. So like essentially the water, I will come back to that, but the water cannot go, cannot reach really far down in the ground anymore. So like the water will tend to stay higher up at the surface of the top horizons of the soil, and so like soil moisture will tend to increase, but you will lose, you can lose on the long term like a certain amount of water further down. So like, yeah, you also lose the sponge effect. And obviously because you lose the sponge effect, the filter effect also is gone. So you end up having like, you switch from this, clear water rivers coming from pristine forests to yes, muddy water essentially. And just to illustrate that a bit further, so yes, after a fire, that's the kind of effect you can actually see. So here, that's a good illustration that you have no canopy anymore. You can definitely tell that the forest floor has been burned down pretty bad as well. And here, that's another illustration. There is nothing left. That's on a pretty steep slope. And here you can quite easily imagine that when it's going to start to rain, like everything is going to be flushed down, and water is going to come up like a pretty bad quality. Here, that's an illustration of hydrophobicity. Same thing, you probably heard this word quite a bit, or maybe water repellency during the floods last fall in BC. Even though fires probably had only a marginal effect on the overall event, it's a critical aspect locally in terms of post-fire hydrology. And what happens here is like, well, when organic matter is during combustion of fuels, there are a number of chemical compounds that are that turn into gases, and most of them go up in the smoke, but a part of them just go further downward in the soil. And by reaching downward, by going downward, they reach lower temperatures, and then they precipitate. And when they precipitate, they form this kind of coating around soil particles that essentially makes the soil waterproof, and that creates this kind of like huge, like large sheets of waterproof layers. And then when the rain comes, well, everything is just washed away. Yes, because the water can infiltrate. In Canada, there is a big aspect linked to snow, because especially in Western Canada, we have many watersheds that are snow flow is snow dominated. But after a large fire, we're going to usually have lower snow accumulation, and especially we're going to have earlier snow melt, which can become a nightmare when you're a water resource manager and try to plan for your year in terms of water supply. And increasingly, we have concerns when it comes to smoke deposition on water bodies. It's something that has been suspected for a long time, but nobody really we didn't have very strong evidence of this effect. And there's been recent publications that really show that even in unburnt watershed, but that are kind of covered by smoke for a part of the year, we see a signal in terms of changes to water quality. And smoke tends to contain a whole lot of mercury that can get deposited and switch to methyl mercury that is pretty dangerous for aquatic ecosystem and people. And so those watershed functions have changed. What it means downstream after rainfall, well, that's a few illustrations here, the type of erosion you can see. That's in Montana. Here there is a person in the middle, and that's a gully in a burned area. And here, we're not only talking about sediments, we're talking about rocks, boulders. You can easily imagine the damaging power of like a mudslide coming from something like that. Here, that's another, the Cameron Falls. Here, that's another illustration. It's not really it's more mud, or kind of it's a mix of ashes, sediments. It's more like a mud flow than anything else. And you have usually you have a shorter what we call concentration time. So yeah, your catchments become more flashy, and they tend to have this very thick water with loaded with debris that have very high damage potential. And a very big thing after fires, and that relates to water quality as well, is the sudden increase in nutrient concentration. Because this filter function is gone, a lot of you might have a lot of nutrients, especially phosphorus and nitrogen, carbon to an extent, and other of things like heavy metals that actually go down to the rivers or lakes. And that can, well, nutrients are usually what limit the biological activity. And when it gets to those water bodies, well, suddenly you have, in many cases, you have a sudden increase in biological activity, and so more algae, and we think that we can have some eutrophication as well. So it can be pretty bad for same thing for aquatic ecosystem, water supply, and human health overall. And this leads me to this idea of wildfire watershed risk. So you have those watersheds that can't really fulfill their functions anymore. And it rains, you have all those changes to water quality, to water availability, water timing, and downstream you have like those kind of receiving communities that well, you have to bear the consequences, and usually negative consequences of those wildfires. And here that's an illustration of a debris flow after a wildfire. But for a good example of that, you can look at the 2018 Montecito mudslide in California that killed, I think, 23 people, and I think that there was nearly $15 million of insurance claims as well, like $15 million of damages. So that definitely can be a problem. Obviously, for fish and aquatic ecosystems overall, when those eutrophication that I mentioned just before, it's definitely pretty bad for aquatic ecosystems. But also, when you have a sudden increase in ash or sediments, you can have fairly quick drop in oxygen, and obviously fish still need to breathe. So you can have massive fish die-off that once again was observed and fairly well documented in Australia a couple of years ago. This is a kind of also a new field. A new topic that is being looked at in research right now is when we have wildland urban interface fires, there are a number of human-made compounds that are just that just burn, and that can end up in the rivers. The thing is, like, we're not sure. We know they can be toxic, but how toxic? What is their what are those compounds actually? I'm not sure we actually have like a very an exhaustive list of those compounds that can be found after a fire, and how much of how mobile they are, how easy it is for those compounds to reach nearby waterways. What is their potential consequences on aquatic ecosystems? All those things we don't really know. But the little bit of the few publications we have on that don't look good either. We're talking about carcinogenic compounds. So something I have to keep an eye on, something very new as well. Here another illustration. That's in Southern California as well. It's a small reservoir, usually it's a reservoir, so usually it looks like a lake, but here it's filled in with sediments from upstream burnt areas. And when we talk about, that's a small reservoir, but still, talking about dredging a reservoir like that, we're talking about millions of dollars. So try to think about it when it comes to in terms of money, budget for communities. How do you deal with that? Millions of dollars to clean what you need to provide drinking water to your community. Here, that's another example of burnt area, a gully, and in the middle you have water pipes, that are obviously, you can see, they are damaged. Same thing, can be costly for your community. And here, that's an example that those are jars. That's what is used usually. It's just an illustration, but it's what it's used for drinking water supply. And when we test, we get the raw water quality, and we test what is the proper dosage of some chemical compounds that are used for water treatment. And usually the more polluted the water is, the more chemicals you need to add to treat it. And so it means more chemicals. It means that you have to pay more money to get them. It also means that usually it puts more strain on the water treatment production system, and it means that it costs more money. So overall, there are human health issues, but a lot of the problems that we're talking about right now in terms of wildfire watershed risk are problems of economic problems mostly. How do we deal with this kind of impacts to our communities, to the production of drinking water, to tourism? fishing, like this kind of things, you know. So just to summarize what I just talked about, and it's a paper that I'm preparing right now, but like wildfire watershed risks are essentially cascading risks. So you have what I call first order risks, like what is the vulnerability of those upstream forested watersheds that provide water to downstream communities? How fire prone they are in case they burn, how susceptible they are to you know, post-fire erosion, to yes, like how susceptible they are to fire, and how their hydrology might change after a fire. So those watersheds that provide a certain amount of water-related ecosystem services, well, so they might have a certain amount of risk. But let's say a fire happens, and those water ecosystem services are, you know, are impacted. What does it mean for downstream users? Can be communities, can be ecosystems, industries, and that's what I call second-order risks. So you have a risk to the supply, and you have a risk to the demand, and increasingly, I guess in ecosystem services science, that, or even risk and disaster science, that is really something that is taking more and more room. For the longest time, in risk and disaster science, we focused on risk to people, or risk to you know, structures and infrastructures. But increasingly, it's been a few years now that we've been increasingly talking about risks to ecosystem services. And I think, like, when we talk about wildfire watershed risk, it fits very well into this idea of risk to water to ecosystem services. And I guess, like, during my PhD, I was interested in knowing, like, more than just, oh, what can happen in what I call, like, fire-aware countries, or like countries that really invest in wildfire science, and in countries where we have we're starting to have a fairly good idea of what happens after a fire. And obviously, I'm talking about Australia, the US, Canada to an extent, Portugal, Spain, but a little bit South Africa. But we didn't even have, like, an idea of what's going on the global scale. So I wanted to have an idea. I wanted to be like, okay, like, it can only be a risk that we have here in generally speaking, in Western countries. So I created these maps, like, using composite indicator methods, and I'll come back to the use of composite indicators because that's something I really like to use. And as you can see here in this first index, like, it's an exposure index. So how much, like, water resources are exposed to fire activity. So obviously here, like, the pattern is highly driven by, I think that was runoff here, available runoff. And here in the second one, I really wanted to model risks. So I really went through various things, like using, like, yeah, upstream hazard, but also downstream receiving communities or ecosystems. And as you can see, well, it's far from being a risk that is only a problem in North America. And usually, because, like, this index was highly driven by the impact potential, you really see, like, where there is a lot of, you know, people, industries, a lot of values at risk, like the risk definitely can be fairly high. And, you know, I'm talking, the title of my presentation, like, it relates to change, and obviously we are going through, like, many, like, through global change, and here that's just an illustration for Canada, and obviously you're all aware that it's a global issue. And obviously, when we talk about global change, we're talking primarily about climate change. And as we can see, we're gonna have to face, you know, like, increasing fire activity, bigger fires, more intense fires. And remember what I said, like, in this kind of in this slide on, like, this sort of recipe. Large and severe fires are, like, the primary driver of wildfire watershed risks. So we're going to have more of that. We're going to have less water as well, just because in Western Canada, for instance, we depend a lot on our glaciers, and those glaciers are melting fast. So we're going to have less water available as well. Less water means more competition for the resource. And when this resource is going to become polluted, probably going to create even more competition. And still climate change, as I said, like, we focused increasingly on extremes. And this comes from I think that was ECCC, like, a recent report on climate change in Canada. And what you can see here is that by the end of the century, we're going to have extreme precipitation much more often. And when we talk about global change, we also talk about changes in social and economic patterns. And what we see in Canada is like we do have, well, a fair amount of wildland human interfaces or wildland society interfaces, and we're going to have more and more of them. And more people in the landscape means more ignitions, means more values at risk from wildfires, but also means like more demand for water. So as I said, like more pressure, but also like more people potentially exposed to polluted water, to post-fire debris flows, these kind of things. And the last, so that's the second of the 3 reports from the assessment report number 6. And the regional reports for North America specifically talks about wildfire risk to fresh water. So it's really getting higher on the list of concerns when it comes to global change. So that's a problem, and I'm trying my best to do something about it. I'm not the only one by far. Like in Canada, actually, probably the leading program working on that is the For Water Network. It's led by the University of Waterloo, Monica and Malco, well, the Ceilings, and it's just a shout out to them, because like it's pretty big network doing a lot of things. But here and here, I'm mostly going to focus on what I'm doing. But obviously, I'm not the only one to work on this topic in Canada. And I'm still quite interested in global issues, just because, as I said, it's not a problem that only exists in Canada or in the US. And here on this map, what you can see is that I try to map wildfire watershed risk hotspots. And what I combine here is just the median. So the global map you saw before for the like global score, like risk score, I took the median score and I combined it with the water stress index from the World Resources Institute aqueduct database. And you have this map coming up, and like I just combined it with here, that's a number of extreme wildfire events. I think like it's those past 30 years or something like that is from David Bowman. And here that's a number of cities that have declared that they're currently having, and in the close future as well, they will be having heavy issues for like to preserve their water quality and water quantity in terms of, well, overall water supply. So like, what I'm saying here, you can go through like some sort of mental gymnastics trying to overlap those 3 maps and be like, oh yeah, we do have a lot of those cities, and that can be in some of those hotspots. But also, you don't necessarily need to have an extreme wildfire event to have those issues. Just like I invite you to read this paper and like have maybe a better idea of like some of the background for this map. But when it comes to the overall research on this topic, it's highly biased towards Western countries. Here you can see on the left, that's for post-fire soil erosion modeling, and you see most of the studies come from North America and Europe. But when you look at where it burns, mostly in the world, what's Africa and South America, and like, let's get real here. When we say North America, it's the US. Like in Canada, we hardly have any on post-fire erosion. And we have a few, but it's not that much. Same thing here. Effects of fire on ecosystem services, not only water, it also takes into account carbon storage, these kind of things. But same thing, you see it's highly biased towards Western countries, and like only like a few biomes, like forested biomes in the Northern Hemisphere. So definitely we don't cover much. We hardly know enough when it comes to it's just 2 illustration, but it applies to the overall field of wildfire watershed risk research. It's highly biased, and we are far from knowing enough. And even in Canada, that's a problem in Canada for sure. If you look here, there are 82 triangles on this map, and it's highly clustered in Western Canada. So British Columbia and Alberta, but also like you have quite a few publications that were done at the experimental lake area in Ontario and around the Gouin Reservoir in Quebec. And that's a conservative that's a conservative map, like a sample, I would say, because like it's the product of a systematic review. So I guess, you can probably, let's say like here there are 82 points. We can probably map up to 150 studies that looked at post-fire, wildfire and post-fire effects on water. But it's still like not much, especially when based on the diversity of fire regimes we have in Canada. And even though we can see that there is an increasing number of publications on post-fire hydrology, post-fire water quality in Canada since 1980, and especially since 2010 or so, like most of those studies just don't talk about risks. So it's mostly focused on, like I talked about, this first order risks, especially like the way watershed can be impacted by a fire in terms of watershed hydrological functioning. So most of those studies really focus on that and don't really focus on downstream effects. Even though, once again, these past 10 years, like this idea of risks after a fire, like this idea of risk to water security has really been growing. But there are definitely efforts that can be done as well. And why do we need to make those efforts? Well, because we need to move towards what we call source water protection. And it's pretty self-explanatory, like source water protection, you are a community, you have your water coming up from this upstream forested watershed, either for drinking water, for tourism, whatever it is. And it's fire prone. So how fire prone this is, and even if there is a fire, what are the kind of consequences that I might expect? So knowing that is important. It's important, especially because once you have data, you can start to run some process-based models. But in Canada, it's very hard to run this kind of process-based model specifically for post-fire analysis, because we don't have enough of those data. That was in what I showed in the map just before. So what we do, and what I do a lot, is like I work with composite indicators. So I take a number of variables that we know after a fire tend to be linked together to produce some sort of downstream effect. And so I can produce related scores per catchment. So here, that's the source exposure index. So how much those catchments are exposed to potential fire issues in terms and downstream supply. And obviously here in Calgary, you can see that those effects might be pretty big, which is also why the city of Calgary is actively working on source water protection and investing millions of dollars in it. And my end goal, that's my main study at the moment. And I was hoping to show you more, but I'm running through a little bit of technical difficulties. But that's research. But I'm getting. I have a solution, a temporary one, but it's getting there. And what it is like, there is this product called Forest to Faucets in the US, and it was like the second version was published last year. And it's a very common product. And as you can see here, like the idea is to connect upstream forests to downstream communities through the amount of water they get from those forested areas. And this is what I'm recreating here in Canada. So here you have like nearly 3,000, that's the location of nearly 3,000 water intakes, where essentially communities have a license to withdraw water from surface water bodies. And I'm working using like a graph analysis, network analysis, to connect that to upstream water supply. It's pretty active work, and it's one of the products that is part of the emergency management strategy for Canada as well. So it's pretty. I'm quite happy I can work on that. And why is that? I'm producing this sort of work here, or even this one, because my idea is to produce, like down the road, I would love to be able to share what we call atlases, and that's why here you have like, I on purpose put Atlas, the Greek Titan that is holding the world on his shoulders. Why that? Because, well, and in France, we use that a lot. Like people have access to risk atlases. You can go for your department, for like your region, for your, to an extent, to your watershed, and skim through the atlas and have a better idea of what's going on in terms of risk, not necessarily only fire. It could be floods, could be a number of things, and that's really what we should. I'm trying to aim towards, and I'm not the only one. Like the Canadian Forest Service right now is really pushing towards having those risk profiles that people can access as well, which is great. But When it comes specifically to water, we still have quite some work to do. Here, that's the results from the last watershed report from WWF. And we don't have enough data. It's a problem in Canada. It's been a problem for several decades now when it comes to water data. We just don't have enough to really monitor the health of our watersheds, especially in the context of global change. This is a bit concerning. And this is concerning because we have reports of issues, like because of those data deficiencies, we have issues when it comes to, for instance, flood mapping. So there are issues of, risk to people down the road. And it's another problem because Canada is a signatory member of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, from which we adapted the emergency management strategy for Canada, which is, as I said, why I'm working at CFS at the moment, and why a lot of people at CFS at the moment are working at. And in this report specifically, in the Sendai Framework, more generally, we talk a lot about data production, data accessibility, and why that? Because we need those data to produce risk information and to be able to share this information with people so they can acquire their own knowledge and we can get towards decision making. But what I said, well, we need more data, but we also need more data access, and this is critical in risk governance, and because here you have that comes from the International Risk Governance Center, and I really invite you to read their documents. It's very interesting, especially you have this phase that is called appraisal, in which we talk about risk, like hazard vulnerability assessment, in which you need a lot of data, but you also need, they talk about concern assessment. So we need to go talk to people, have like lead surveys to have a better idea of how they feel and what is their perception of risk. And you need more people on the ground collecting data as well. So data is at the core of risk governance. We can't do anything about data, but it doesn't mean that we don't have data. And that's another aspect. We live in a world where we always talk about big data, artificial intelligence. We feel like we always need more data. But in a risk, and so wildfire watershed risk can be considered as an emerging risk. So we still need to produce this sort of baseline information. So we know where we started at, where we are starting at, and where we're going towards. And it's essentially we can't put the cart before the horses. So that's a lot of my work. That's a lot of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to really look at to cross available wildfire and water data in Canada. So it's something I produced a couple of years ago. It's nothing complicated at all. I'm almost ashamed it's simplistic, but just another way at looking at wildfire activity from a water management perspective. And as I said, we have a whole lot of diversity in Canada. So we have also a number of what we call fire regime units. As you can see here, we have 60 of them. And if you connect that to the previous map where I showed all those triangles, you see we are far from having covered all those fire regime units in terms of the way they burn, but also how they behave after a burn and in terms of hydrology. So we still have a lot to do, but we do have data to work on that. So we have data, but we don't have all the data that would be ideally we would need. And here that's an illustration of so the wildfire perimeters that we have in the National Fire Database, and what we call so a number of municipal watersheds. And as you can see here, there are only 3 provinces because the information is it's not available for other provinces and territories, either because it doesn't exist at all or because it's not public, in open access. And this is something that needs to change. The amount of time, the map I showed earlier was the water licenses, all those dots. It took me a year to put together because it's a lot of, I have to contact the provinces, spend time on the phone, find the right person. It shouldn't be the case. We should have for this kind of things, especially as this type of risk is getting higher up on the concern list. We should be able to access this kind of data much faster. This is another quick illustration, but you see like here, those are the watersheds from a water survey of Canada. There are nearly like 1,700 of them. Although Water Survey of Canada has 8,000 historical gauges, so like we are missing quite a few watersheds. And as you can see, especially we're missing watersheds with hydrological records in areas that burn a lot in Quebec and Ontario. So same thing, like we need to get those data. But once again, we can also start to do some work here where it burns and where we have watersheds and hydrological record as well. And I talked a lot about composite indicators because I think they are very handy, especially when we talk about something that is so new and complex as wildfire watershed risks. And you guys are probably familiar with the Human Development Index. There are a whole lot of them that are being created. Why that? Because it's a easy and can be like very robust way to put together a lot of information about very complex issues, and yet put them in some sort of like craft them into a final product that people can grasp fairly easily. So it's very good for communication. Because it's good for communication, it's great for advocacy. Like if you know that there is an area where it's at risk, you can actually go and try to advocate for some sort of specific management measures. Because you can advocate, you can push towards policy making. Once you have those policies, that's a great thing with those indicators. It's pretty easy to redo them. So you have to update the data, obviously. But then you can look at trends and how efficient those new policies are. Or you can look at trends like about the effect of climate change, let's say. And so overall, those composite indicators, although they are highly criticized, people think they're like too simple, but I'm telling you it's not. But you can really use that for, targeted action on several problems. All right, I'm reaching the end of this presentation, and if there are a few things I want you guys to take back home is yes, forests are critical for water security for a number of reasons. And I'm not saying that we need to plant more trees. I'm not saying that we should keep fire outside of those forests. Like not too much forest is not necessarily good, but there is definitely an important role, especially in Canada, for forests and water security. And wildfires and their effect on those forests and the water coming from those forested watersheds is definitely emerging but growing fast. We're talking more and more about this issue. Like global change is going to make this problem worse, and it's not going anywhere, not going anywhere anytime soon. And but to deal with that, I think there is an increasing acknowledgement of the problem. But to better deal with that, we need to get better at both using the data we already have to create this baseline information I'm talking about, but we also need to invest more in like collecting data where we don't have enough. But overall, trying to reach this kind of open access public data records is like really important for the future of dealing with this risk in Canada. And with this last slide here, I just want to say that I really feel like myself and other people working in this field, we really have achieved something very major, which is why we keep doing science and working on this topic. Like 9 years ago when I started to work on that, and even before in France, like 15 years ago, like having reports, like fire reports that would talk about water, or water reports that would talk about fire, like big reports like that, you wouldn't see. Essentially, you wouldn't see that. That was like, you would have some mentions here and there, but like it didn't really exist. Now you have, well, here on the right, that the new water security strategy and fund for British Columbia, well, wildfires in watersheds is like one of the top issue. You have here like the very recent, the recent Health of Canadian and Changing Climate report, where they actually used my work, but really like saying like, yeah, wildfire risk to water security is a health issue for Canadians. And here I was very lucky to be one of the co-authors to this recent report from the UN, in which I wrote the water security section. So there is in a wildfire report a dedicated water security section. And anyways, I just wanted to say that it's great after 9 years that to see like I feel that I've achieved something, and I'm very happy about it. And with that, I'd be happy to further discuss the topic. I'm very grateful for your presence today.